philosophy, not psychology, but philosophy. When you see if the students within the psychology field, they didn't even take any philosophy classes, then they're not going to be capable of finding these parameters, in finding these borders, in finding who's actually the mastermind of such an interpretation. Why are we being told that that's the interpretation to such behavior and so forth? Now, of course, this, I don't know how we got into this, but when you look at al-aqad, I would say that's one thing that we're really missing out on, which is when we speak about women, I think we need more of neuroscience to help us understand those differences are real. Those differences are real. And they're not as the psychology department or the women's study department and the gender and all of that, and it's made within the society, or it's somehow I guess cultural influenced, and it's not a cultural influence. A lot of it is actually going back to the actual difference that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in men and women. And therefore, if we don't recognize such differences, the differences are going to really come at us and we're going to clash. And this is, inshallah, just on another topic. Okay, so we're going to get...
أنا روح أخذني كثير بعيد عن موضوعي. على كل حال ما حيمشي الحال بهيك وقت. إذا في وقت تاني بيكون أحسن يا
إن
ريت.
شاء الله إن شاء الله نتعود نحكي إن شاء الله. والموضوع يعني طبعا ذو شجون إن شئتي فإن شاء الله بنعود نحكي إن شاء الله.
جزاك الله خير.
وإياكم. So here it is, everybody. We are back in our tafsir, inshallah, and we were actually doing a number of different ayat right there, and we pretty much had just a little tiny bit left with our tafsir. So let's actually go there and speak about, of course, a number of different issues if we're talking about certainly al-qasas, we're talking about al-qawad, we're talking about what really happens in terms of different assaults happening in different situations of court, and what would make a fair, at least a fair, let's call it compensation, or a fair judgment, or a fair, of course, or justice right there. How do we actually deal with all of that? And we went in detail with some of the things, but then here's one topic which really rather is interesting, which is here he says, وَاخْتَلَفُوا فِي عَقْلِ جِرَاحَاتِ النِّسَاءِ. This is not talking about mind, okay? Al-aql here is actually talking about the compensation when an assault happens. What really happens? And let's see right there, just stay. I want you to hold your horses, don't rush, okay? Let's see. So he said in Muwatta Malik, there is a hadith Yahya ibn Sa'id and Sa'id ibn Musayyib, or al-Musayyib. He's actually one of the most important scholars. We talked about him before. أنه كان يقول تعاقل المرأة الرجل إلى ثلث الدية. Stop right here. What does that mean? So the first opinion is that a woman's diya, or a woman's blood money, or let's say the compensation, if there was an assault on a woman, is it equal to what if we were to say the same exact assault happened on a man? Is she going to get the same compensation or not? And here he said that a woman's compensation would actually be similar until the amount reaches 1/3 of the diya. So we're looking at 150,000, for example. Okay, roughly, this isn't the real number, but 150,000. If we're talking about it reaching to 50,000, then in that situation, we're not going to use the same numbering. So it would be, if for a man, we might actually will look at the compensation, but once it basically reaches 1/3 of the men, then in that situation, we're going to reverse certain numbers. So let's continue. And he said, إصبعها كإصبعه. So one finger is like one finger, one tooth is like one tooth, in a laceration to compare to another laceration, or even if we're talking about bone dislocation, it's going to be the same thing. But then if she reaches 1/3 of the amount of men, then in that situation, it would just go into being half. Is that necessarily 100% true? Where did this come from? Hold on, just wait. And let's see, so we've got, what is it? We've got Sa'id ibn Musayyib right there, and where he's basically stating that. Where's that coming from? Let's see. Here's another opinion, that a woman's diya would be half the men's diya, whether we're speaking about a smaller number or a bigger number. So let's say a woman's finger, all right, would be a man's finger would be well, a woman's finger would be equivalent to the price of course, half a man's finger. Is that what he was saying? Well, this is the second opinion. What did they actually depend on? Well, they said because anyways, there's a hadith that a woman's diya is half the men's diya. So they said, well, if we're talking about a bigger number, like a diya, then in other words, a life for a life, then in that situation, if of course we're talking about the diya really being half, then in that situation, according to this analogy, in where if we're talking about something smaller, then it would be half. So if it's the price of let's say an assault on a man's finger, let's say was let's say $7,000, then an assault on a woman's finger would basically be 3.5. Okay, is that what they had all agreed on? Well, let's see where all of this is actually coming from. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to our Nail al-Awtar. Nail al-Awtar, just an idea about Nail al-Awtar. Let me write that down. And where Nail al-Awtar, I want you to actually see it. This book, Nail al-Awtar, is one of those books that are, you could see it's not too big, even though it appears here too big, but it's actually not that big. This is more like it. So you could see that they probably just did a lot of tahqiq on this. That's why it appears too big. This is actually more like it. Something more, 6 volumes, that's basically it. What Ishawkani had done, Ishawkani died, just to put that within perspective, 1250 50 Hijriya. So we're looking at somebody rather roughly, we're talking about almost 250 years ago, not too long. Okay, so it wasn't part of the really early scholars. Okay, he was from Yemen, and he was Zaydi in madhab / Shia, and then later he became Shafi'i. Okay, he was a qadi. What he did in his book is really a really interesting thing, in where that's what we studied from my professor in Sharia and Fiqh, to be more exact and more specific. He would always let us study from this book. So we would go back to this book, and what he did, this is a page from it. So here it is. Instead of me, I guess, downloading the whole PDF, I could just go to this website and actually show you the actual book. And instead of downloading the whole thing, gives me the volume number, the volume number and the page number. How does Ishawkani actually do the job? So what he would do, in where he would bring all the important ahadith related to the subject, and then he would actually go in details and going to the differences of opinions and discussing the details and discussing even the authenticity of the evidences and so forth. So those are the 2 ahadith related to this subject. Let's see. this hadith right there in where Amr ibn Shu'aib عن أبيه عن جده. Now, this right there, chain of narration, is actually considered one of the strongest chain of narrations. That he had said that the Prophet ﷺ had said, عقل المرأة مثل عقل الرجل حتى يبلغ الثلث من ديته. That where we're talking about here, we're not talking about mind here, we're not talking about brain, we're actually talking about the compensation for an assault, that it would be that for the woman, it would be similar to the man until it would reach 1/3 of the diya. 1/3 of the diya, we're talking about the equivalent price of let's say, the compensation for a whole life. If we say right there, 150,000, for example, if there was an assault, a direct assault on somebody's life, then the diya would actually be 150,000. Okay, then we're talking about 1/3. Let's see. رواه النسائي والدارقطني. So you could see narrated by Nasa'i and Darqutni. Let's see the other chain of narration. Rabi'a ibn Abi Abdurrahman, he went to Sa'id ibn Musayyib and he asked him, and of course, this is a tabi'i right there. And he said, how much would be the compensation for one woman's finger? And he said, 10 camels. So the price of 10 camels. And then he said, what about 2 fingers? He said 2. And he said, what about 3 fingers? And he said, well, 30 camels. And he said, what about 4? And he said, 20. And he said, well, so when she had 4 fingers, the assault was on 4 fingers, and when the assault was bigger and her calamity was bigger, you basically reduced the price for it. So it's like, okay, when she had 3 fingers, an assault on 3 fingers, her compensation was 30, equivalent to 30 camels. But when she had 4 fingers, the assault was on 4 fingers, it went down to 20. How is that even making sense? So Sa'id responded and he said, are you coming from Iraq? And he said, no, I'm just somebody that wants to learn, or somebody that is ignorant trying to learn, or somebody that is a scholar that's really trying to review my resources. And he said, that is Sa'id ibn Musayyib. He said, well, that's the sunnah, my nephew. And of course, this is the narration. So here's one thing in where, let's say, we're talking about 2 things here, but did Shawkani necessarily take that as what was actually mentioned? Let's see how he scrutinizes the evidences and
Can I
talks
ask
about.
one question, please?
Yep, go ahead.
Go far. The hadith that talk about the fingers that she lost, when he said
This isn't a hadith. This would be an athar.
يا أثر حين عظم جرحها واشتدت مصيبتها نقص عقلها. Exactly what does he mean with نقص عقلها؟
نقص عقلها أي ثمن أو بمعنى
فدية.
الفدية، ما يفتديه، يعني الثمن اللي هي طبعا تاخد فيه الجزاء، أو طبعا بسبب العقل. هنا لا نتحدث عن العقل بمعنى الفكر، أو نتحدث عن العقل بمعنى الضبط. هنا نتحدث عن العقل بمعنى اللي هو الجزاء الذي تأخذ هذه المرأة جراء هذا الاعتداء.
يعني هل لها علاقة بناقصات عقل ودين؟
لا لا لا، لا علاقة أبدا أبدا، لا من قريب ولا من بعيد. نتحدث هنا عن العقل بمعنى الدية.
يعني
هنا لا نتحدث أبدا، لا من قريب ولا من بعيد، لا علاقة أو أصلا ولا من قريب ولا من بعيد بمعنى العقل بمعنى الضبط.
يعني هنالك ظلم في
هذا ما أراد أن يقوله اللي هو ربيعة ابن أبي عبد الرحمن.
نعم.
إنه يعني هذا، يعني كيف ممكن تخريج هذه المسألة، إنه كلما اشتدت المصيبة المفروض إنه يزاد في التعويض ولا يقل في التعويض ولا ينقص في التعويض.
نعم.
All right. So
Mm.
ladies, this has nothing to do with women and the issue about aql and the issue about mind and the issue about her ability to focus. This has nothing to do with it. So when we're talking about this word aql here in this context has nothing to do with mind. No scholar ever said that this is relating to mind whatsoever. This is relating to the compensation in relationship to the assault. In other words, it's basically speaking about the diya. Okay,
آه.
so what Abi Abdul Rah or Rabi'a ibn Abi Abdul Rahman right here was really trying to say is that how does it make sense that we're speaking about an assault in where if the assault basically grows, what you would, hey, an analogy would be if the assault got worse, the analogy and what would make sense is that the compensation is supposed to be bigger, not less.
Right.
That's what he was saying. So if we're looking at, hey, if 3 fingers were basically, the assault, and then you're saying 30, and then when it's 4, we went back to 20. How's that making sense? That's what he was trying to say. So let's say right there in where, how do we understand this? So majority of the scholars, they actually took it as, well, that's it. He is sunnah. That's the sunnah. That's what we're going to do. We're just going to take the text as is, despite the fact that it doesn't make sense. That's majority. Well, is that how a person that was trained in qada and a person that actually had, let's say, il-malaka, the ability to scrutinize these evidences. And let's see what he had said. So he said, for the hadith, you could see that this hadith, he said, صحح هذا الحديث Ibn Khuzaymah. He said, well, this hadith, you could see it was authentic. And then, of course, you could see in Bulugh al-Maram, of course, in Bulugh al-Maram, it's going to be Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and so forth. You could see they basically consider that hadith is actually authentic. So he wasn't questioning that. But for the part in where, well, what does it mean حتى يبلغ الثلث من ديته? What does that really mean in practice? So we're right here seeing that Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, he basically said, well, until it reaches 1/3, are we talking 1/3 of the whole thing? Or are we talking about 1/3 what is beyond, let's say, this amount? So let's continue and see it. Okay, so here he said, as for the hadith, which is the second one, in where the application, the implementation for this hadith and how it's done, all right, he said, well, I don't necessarily, he said, well, for the hadith, وَعَلَى تسليم أن قوله من السنة, then he was questioning, well, when he said, well, it's the sunnah, basically, that's what it is. This is the application. And where if it's 4 fingers, then the price would basically go down. Let's use the word price or the compensation, okay? And he said, well, what here would be a place of question is what really does it mean that this is the sunnah? Is this necessarily that the Prophet ﷺ implemented it in this way, or is their understanding that this is how you would implement this general default ruling? In whose sunnah is it? And that's that place of question. Is this the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, or is this the sunnah of the people of Ahl al-Madinah to what they thought was supposed to be the fair practice? That's what he then started questioning. And he said, well, here we go. He said, Rawa Sahib al-Talkhis. Sahib al-Talkhis would be, Talkhis al-Habir would be Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. He said it was narrated that Malik used to say that يذكر أنه السنة وكنت أتابعه عليه وفي نفسي منه شيء ثم علمت أنه يريد أنه سنة أهل المدينة فرجعت عنه. So what happened? He said, Shafi'i had said, Malik used to say that this was the sunnah, and I used to consider that, in other words, I used to embrace it, that yes, it's the sunnah. But he said, but deep on the inside, I felt that there was something rather odd in it. And then later on, I learned, in other words, I realized that what he really meant by sunnah, in where it was a practice that was common in Ahl al-Madinah, and he said, then I left that interpretation. So what did he realize? He realized that it's not necessarily sunnah to mean prophetic tradition as much as it was a cultural practice. There's a difference. If we're
Is it
talking about a prophetic tradition, that would mean a specific type of sunnah, because the word sunnah actually has different definitions. You've got one sunnah definition to actually mean a certain practice. You wake up early in the morning, you go brush your teeth, I don't know, you drink your cup of coffee, whatever. This is your sunnah, okay? But if we're talking about a specific technical term, sunnah to mean that it's a prophetic tradition, well, there's no question about that. We're not going to question if the Prophet ﷺ had really said something. He practiced a certain thing, and we know that what the sunnah, the wording of the Prophet ﷺ, the prophetic tradition, was really saying that this is how it's supposed to be done. Then in that situation, خلاص وما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم. Simple, crystal clear. It is not befit for a believing man or a believing woman, if the Prophet ﷺ rules a matter, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rules any matter, that we would say, well, I put my opinion, or I think, etc. That's it. This is an issue of faith or kufr. All right. So, but of course,
so sunnah here, Ahl al-Madinah, does it mean like uruf, ethical?
absolutely, tradition, of course, of course. So this is
Uh,
talking about a cultural tradition. Now he wanted to scrutinize that and say, well, later I discovered that it was more of a cultural practice than actually a religious, let's call it a tradition that was taken from the Prophet. So that's what he wanted to do. Let's see. And he said there is another hadith that the Prophet ﷺ had said, Diyatul mar'a nisfu diyatul rajul, that the diya, that the blood money for women is half that of men. And he said, well, you could see that al-Bayhaqi, a very important Shafi'i scholar, that he said, isnaduhu la yathbutu mithluhu, that this isnad, in where it's not necessarily an authentic one. Oh, let's see right there. You could see, he said, وأخرج البيهقي عن علي بن أبي طالب, or عن علي عليه السلام. The reason why he says عليه السلام, remember, he actually was he was 80. Okay, so he said دية المرأة على النصف من دية الرجل في الكل. Could see that he also had said that there is an opinion that in general that the woman's diya is actually half of the man's diya. And of course wanted to say, well, that actually mean that even أرش المرأة يساوي أرش الرجل في الجراحات التي لا يبلغ. So what does that mean? We're talking, al-arsh is basically the compensation for not the whole life of a person, but we're talking about, al-arsh would be basically the assault on different parts of the body, in where it would actually be half the, it would be, sorry, the same with a man, unless it reaches 1/3. Let's see, that's that opinion in where is that necessarily the same. Let's see, and he said majority of the scholars, and even those that were in Medina, when of course Sa'id ibn Musayyib was in Medina as well. And he said, well, you could see that they had adopted this opinion. And of course, and he mentions the story that we just said earlier. And he said, and the reason why he had made and interpreted that, hey, until it reaches 1/3, and basically then we would start going back in number. And he said the reason why he had said that is basically it went more than 1/3. And then look at this one. And then he would consider that even if it goes worse, if it goes more, then we're going to look at the third in general of what makes a diya, and then we're going to start looking at 1/3 of what is equivalent. Let's see. We're going to continue in talking about this. Hold on. And let's see. And he said, if he meant by a sunnah that it is basically what was evident from the Prophet ﷺ, he said, ولكن مع الاحتمال لا ينتهض إطلاق تلك السنة للاحتجاج به. So what does that mean? He said, well, because we're seeing that in this quote, in where he said, hiya sunnah, in where this actually makes it that it is a more of a possibility. In other words, we cannot depend on an interpretation that it really is the sunnah, and therefore, when we have al-ihtimal, in other words, the possibility that perhaps it wasn't really the Prophet ﷺ sunnah, but it was more of their cultural tradition, he said, then therefore, we can't necessarily use that as an evidence to prove that this really is a prophetic tradition and not a cultural one. Let's see, in where that's why he said Shafi'i doubted whether this really was a prophetic tradition or a cultural one. And he said, because this is why he regarded it as mursal, لا تقوم به حجة. So what does that mean? He said, well, just because Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, where's that hadith? Right there. Sa'id al-Musayyib had mentioned this. We can't necessarily depend on such an interpretation and say, well, we've got an evidence to prove it, because right there, he said, this actually makes it, well, we don't really know the chain of narration to all of this. This could be his own interpretation. This could be his own interpretation, and that interpretation, one, we don't necessarily know the source of it, and we cannot necessarily prove that this actually means that this is going back to the Prophet ﷺ, but this is rather his own interpretation, making this idea itself and what it carries more of mursal, meaning that it does not have a strong narration to the Prophet ﷺ. The chain of narration is completely broken. We don't even to the idea, that is, because we don't know the Sahabi, we don't know any details where this idea is coming from. So to even call it marfu', it doesn't even stand to the marfu'. It doesn't even go up to that level. So he said, well, this actually makes this whole idea in where something that we can't necessarily just accepted that it is the sunnah, and therefore this is what Islam says, basically. So that's what he was trying to go against, and where, hey, I can't necessarily accept that this is the sunnah, this is what Islam says. It was more of cultural tradition, and so therefore I can't use this as a basis to prove in where what would actually make a fair trial and a fair injustice. Let's see. So therefore, he said, and what would make sense in where in general we're supposed to actually speak about the basis is supposed to be inequality, and where it's supposed to be an eye for an eye, that's the default ruling, in where people are equal. To make an exception, you're supposed to have an evidence to support that there is an evidence to support such an exception. So when we talk about the general default ruling, is that men or women are equal. The only times that you would want to say they're different, whether we're speaking about criminal law, whether we're speaking about laws of worship, whether we're speaking about social things, the right to give a divorce, marriage, etc. If we've got an evidence in the Quran and in the Sunnah to prove that, no, we're going to change certain things due to the psychological differences, the physical differences, the anatomy, whatever it is, all those differences, then we're just going to say sami'na wa ata'na. So here, he's basically saying, well, what we're supposed to be doing is that we're actually supposed to go to the default ruling, is that their an assault on a man is supposed to be equivalent to the assault on a woman. And therefore, he basically said, and therefore, the interpretation to this is that if we're speaking about then the extra third, okay, so we're talking about, let's say, we're talking about the money, and where, yes, let's say, and he said, we're talking about the money in where if it goes beyond the half, then, or the third, then in that situation, what we would do, because this would be, of course, not making justice, and in order to go against justice, of course, it wouldn't make sense to go against even what makes logic or even analogy, and even go against justice. He said, without any evidence, بلا حجة نيرة, makes no sense, because يتقحم الإنسان في مضيق مخالفا للعدل والعقل والقياس بلا حجة نيرة. He said it makes no sense to actually somehow interject our own human interpretation when we see that it's completely contradictory to justice or even common sense or even analogy, without any evidence to prove that we would actually practice it that way. And that's why, of course, you could see in where you could see different interpretations in where they basically had no, until it basically becomes one half, then it would basically be a different rule and settle. So how did and what did he actually want to say? So let's see. He wanted to lay out the differences of opinions in where, okay, is it half? And then once it goes into half, or at least once it goes beyond that number. So the second opinion, they said, let's say, let's look at the word and the number 4 right there, 4 fingers. And then based on that, so the other scholars, they said, no, once it reaches beyond that, then it's going to be half the diya. So we would jump into half the diya if it goes to that number. Half the diya, so 150,000, now we're looking at 75,000 right there. And then based on the second opinion. But let's see in where, what did, let's see right there, hold on, the point that I wanted to say. Okay. Okay, the point that I wanted to actually say, there was in where for Shawkani, what he wanted to say is that no, what that would be, what would the application would be in where if it goes beyond, then in that situation, what is beyond the 1/3, it would be, sorry, let me reword this. What would be, it would be equal to the men's diya or equal to the men's aql, but then once it goes more than, of course, a thuluth, 1/3, then in that situation, we would start making another counting in where it would be 1/3 later on of what is more, oh boy. I'm totally, okay.
That's a little confusing.
It's a little confused. You know what? Let me take you to Mustafa Zarqa. He worded this beautifully. Let's actually go to this one, in where Mustafa Zarqa had actually done a good job in wording this. That wasn't the article that I wanted to take you to. Let's see. Was it? Let's see. Maybe it's this one, in where Mustafa Zarqa, he actually, okay, here we go. This is the article. Let's see. So Mustafa Zarqa, who's Mustafa Zarqa? Let me just give you an idea about Mustafa Zarqa. Okay, Mustafa Zarqa, he was actually a scholar, a Syrian scholar. This is Mustafa Zarqa. And of course, the Syrian scholar, he also studied law. He studied, you could say, he wasn't long ago when he had actually died. One of the great scholars, one of the great Syrian scholars. So Mustafa Zarqa, from Halab, of course, and he basically he wasn't aware of what Shawkani had said. And he looked into that and he felt that that wasn't necessarily evident to actually speak it in this way. And of course, some people might actually say, why are you going to Islam online? There's nothing wrong with going if we're speaking about research that was well done. And of course, Mustafa Zarqa saw that this exactly like when we're speaking about Nail al-Awtar, and where, of course, even Shawkani had felt that this was not making sense. It was not making, of course, any sense, not logically, and certainly not in justice. And he said, and I felt that that was really rather odd, and then went and saw that, no, it's more of Sa'id ibn Musayyib's, let's say, take and his own interpretation, and not necessarily the tradition itself. So that's when he basically had interpreted this hadith. And remember, we're looking at this hadith in where the Prophet ﷺ had actually said, عقل المرأة مثل عقل الرجل حتى يبلغ الثلث من ديته. In where, how did he actually explain that? He said, well, what that would mean, in where he said, I personally, every time I would think of this, he said, I would right there, it would come to my mind and I can't just digest it. And then I would say, well, if he said it's the sunnah, I'll just accept it. And I would just not think about it. Then, of course, when he went, of course, to Sayyid Diya al-Haq, and he wanted to make, I guess, the constitution for Pakistan and all of that, that's when, of course, he felt that it wasn't enough to just say it's the sunnah and that people just have to accept it, but there has to be an interpretation that would make sense. And you can't just say it's the sunnah and that's basically it. So what he said is that it would be 34, of course, 30 camels, equivalent to assault on 3 fingers, in where it would be exactly like the man. All right. But then 30 for, of course, for the remaining 30, or at least in where we've got 9 fingers, and it would be, of course, 9 fingers, it would be 60 camels, equivalent to 60 camels, because the whole diya would be 50. And then therefore, it would make no sense as to what he was saying. And he said, Shawkani himself, when he had come across Shawkani, where what he was saying is that he went back and he said that he had taken, where he said the hadith that was mentioned, it does not necessarily indicate that a woman's at least the compensation would be 1/3, but what it shows is that if it goes beyond the 1/3, then in that situation we would actually make it that she would basically get half the remaining 1/3, and therefore,
Okay, that makes sense.
yeah, half the 1/3 if it goes beyond. All right. And then therefore, it would basically, and this is the point that he wanted to say right there, in where, in other words, if we're speaking about, let's continue right there, in where if we're talking about, let's say, 4 fingers, according to Sa'id ibn Musayyib, was going to be 20, equivalent to 20 camels. But he was saying, no, it would actually be equivalent to 35. What about men? It would be equivalent to 40 camels. Are you understanding it here? Does that make sense?
Yes, alhamdulillah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah,
so,
because we're Muslims are supposed to be the best in math, right?
of course, but I think right now you could see that, I'm going into these fractions and I'm going in confusion, going to this confusion, even my words, you could see I need a little bit more focus, inshallah. Mustafa Zarqa, I think it's important to mention. Mustafa Zarqa is one of those scholars that did an outstanding job, not only in fiqh, but because he studied law, that actually helped him, I would say, canonize fiqh. And that was something extremely important, because when we're speaking about law, many times it would be hard to see that that language in law, the terminologies, it would become jargons in fiqh. And there was this distinction between, of course, those that were specialized in law, and certainly many studied in different universities, even in the West. And then when they came over, of course, it was time to use in the system of constitutions. Then how are we going to embed Islamic studies and Islamic law within the constitution that is actually based on secular law? So Mustafa Zarqa actually spoke 4 languages. He spoke German, he spoke English, he spoke French, he spoke Arabic, and studied law, and even taught law at the university, and even studied Sharia, and certainly memorized the Quran. So you could see a person that was always considered the pioneer and at the forefront whenever different matters in law were discussed. And Mustafa Zarqa is one of those scholars that my professor would always tell us to go back to and see what his take is on different matters, because it's important to also make use of modern law, even if it's secular law, because right now we're seeing different systems in where, what I mean by different systems, in where different systems are right now becoming, let's say, in handy, and certainly coming to use for the different experts in order to make sure that we're actually getting a fair judgment there, and not necessarily rushing into considering that this is what actually makes a fair judgment, without us realizing that there are different resources and different ways of how we can understand the application and the implementation of law. Okay, let's continue right there, where hopefully, inshallah, we'll finish this ayah today. Let's go back in where Al-Qadi Abdul Wahab, basically right there in, are we talking about the same assault or the same rule, in where if we're talking about, for example, the eyebrows or even the hair on the head, or of course, probably just the different things that is more of aesthetics than actually something that they would benefit from. So of course, when we're talking about a man's breast, for example, it's not equivalent to a woman's breast, because a woman's breast, of course, if she were to get a mastectomy, or even if she were to get in any way, of course, the harm on the breast is not at all going to be equivalent the way that would probably harm a man. And whether we're speaking about same thing, if we're talking about the buttocks, of course, it's not going to be, the harm is not going to be equivalent to, if we're talking about a core harm to perhaps somebody's head or the bones, etc. But of course, in that situation, he said it would be an issue of hukuma. What is hukuma? Hukuma to basically mean that it would basically go back to the judge himself, and then they would يقوم المجني عليه لو كان عبدا سليما. In other words, the Qadi himself, he would evaluate the victim and what actually happened to them. And then they, based on that evaluation and looking at the circumstances that surrounded the assault, then in that situation, we would basically consider, of course, what would make a fair compensation for all of this. Now, this, of course, he said, you could see that most of the scholars, this is what they had basically mentioned. All right, let's continue right there in where فَمَنْ تَصَدَّقَ بِهِ فَهُوَ كَفَّارَةٌ لَهُ. So we're looking at right there and where we passed all of this. فَمَنْ تَصَدَّقَ بِهِ فَهُوَ كَفَّارَةٌ لَهُ. What does that mean? So are we talking about in where the person is making a general sadaqah? No, this is actually talking about a person in where تصدق بالقصاص فعفى فهو كفارة له لذلك المتصدق. So if a person basically were to basically compensate, then in that situation, if it is al-qasas, in other words, they compensated with wealth and said, hey, I'll pay, let's say, 20,000, or perhaps whatever the judge had basically put forward as a fair compensation, that would be the expiation. In other words, if a person does an assault on somebody, okay, and then they pay them the compensation for that assault, then that would be kafara. That would be the expiation. Then the person won't be held accountable for the assault that they had committed if they paid, of course, the money that the qadi, or at least the compensation for this. And of course, some scholars, they basically said, well, this is kafara, not on the person that committed the assault. So this isn't a sin wiper on the person that committed the assault, but this is a compensation for the victim and not for the person that committed the assault. So what does that mean? Are we talking about that this is kafara? This is a remover of the sin if they were to pay the compensation? Or is this a kafara, basically a remover, in other words, to basically compensate for the assault that happened? So are we here speaking about kafara for the person that committed the assault? Or are we talking about kafara for the victim? All right, kafara for the victim or kafara for the person that committed the assault. So, well, both interpretations do actually have, let's say, good basis. If a person committed the assault and they basically compensated, well, that would basically remove the sin because it's basically an eye for an eye, or at least, the compensation to what makes an equivalent compensation. If we're talking about kafaratullah, in where, you've got your compensation right there. So this is supposed to give you the compensation, a fair compensation for the assault that was committed against you. So this would basically be, of course, the fair trial and fair judgment. Let's see. There is rather a hadith in where Abu Darda had narrated that the Prophet ﷺ said, ما من مسلم يصاب بشيء من جسده فيهبه إلا رفع الله به درجة وحط عنه به خطيئة. Every calamity that any Muslim basically goes through in their body, and then they would basically dismiss, in other words, are patient of it, and then that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically elevate them a certain elevation, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically take away from their sins. But here's one thing, you could see that this hadith, الترمذي said this hadith is غريب لا نعرفه إلا من هذا الوجه. What does it mean, غريب? غريب meaning that he doesn't know of other narrators. That's his own terminology for the word غريب, in where it doesn't have any other at least resource that uses that chain of narration. And he said this is the only narration that we have that mentioned this. And I would لا أعرف لأبي السفر سماعا من أبي الدرداء. And he said, I don't know, in that particular chain of narration, don't know that Abu Safar, in other words, that he was trying to indicate that there was a problem in the chain of narration. So what should we do? Should we just go after those that are committing assaults, or those that are basically harming us? Should we go after them? Let's see, Ibn al-Arabi had said, well, if والذي يقول إنه إذا عفى عنه المجروح عفى الله عنه لم يقم عليه دليل فلا معنى له. And he said, well, whoever says, quote, that if the person were to dismiss and forgive whoever committed an assault at them, he said there's no evidence to support that, and where it becomes meaningless to just say, well, you're just going to have to forgive, or that if you were to forgive, that you would basically get rewarded for it, and therefore encouraging you to forgive. So does that mean we should forgive or we shouldn't forgive? So if a person does forgive, in general, forgiving those that had, especially those that had shown remorse, would be something that you would be rewarded for. But to somehow forgive those that are still continuing with their assault, then what you're doing is that you're letting that person get away with their assault. So it's not always fair to say, just forgive. No, certain times it's important to run after those that are committing assaults and that are harming people in order to bring an end and let them know that they will not get away with it. And therefore, you're protecting other people's lives or protecting other people's bodies or perhaps other people's rights. This is
So
important.
I have a question. So
Go
if that kafara is paid, is that person required to go and ask forgiveness from the victim?
So fair enough, if we're speaking about in that there's a difference between al-adab, it is part of al-adab in where even if the person had paid al-kafara, or at least let's call it not al-kafara, but paid the compensation, part of al-adab in where you recognize that you just committed an assault, that no money is probably going to be equivalent to it. Okay, you paid the money, but at the end, the suffering is still there. There's probably some harm still there in where certainly.
Yeah, and it's still, I mean, because it's like you want it to go away before the day of judgment.
Absolutely. So it's part of the adab and part of al-iman and al-salah that a person would actually seek forgiveness for those that they had harmed. That's part of that adab. But it depends on the circumstance in front of you. Some would actually take advantage. Let's say it's a bully. Okay. It's a bully that's bullying everyone. And then one day you decided, I don't know, you decided that, you know what, I'm going to stop and end this. But then, of course, you went and punched this person and you didn't really think it was going to go that far. All of a sudden, you became an Arnold Schwarzenegger and boom, give him this punch and it really went way farther than you had expected. Guess your adrenaline was going up high at that moment. And the punch went way farther than you had expected. And then the judge said, well, yes, he's a bully, but you still went farther and you took the law in your own hands and you went farther. And this is the harm that you had committed. If you see that the person in front of you learned a lesson, they stopped the bullying, etc. So I would say looking at the circumstances that surround the case and who the person is, I think is important to keep in mind and put within context before jumping and saying, yes, we need them to basically go forward and start seeking forgiveness from people. I think one thing is that very often I would say religious people many times thinking that they have to be doormats to other people and not stand up to their rights. Sometimes you really have to put an end to those that are transgressing their limits and letting them know that no, not because you basically are religious, that doesn't mean that you don't know how to defend yourself. Stand up and learn how to defend yourself. And yes, we have taqwa Allah, but taqwa Allah does not mean that I become a doormat and people spit in where they can attack me verbally and they can attack me physically. And I'm supposed to be the nice person there because I'm supposed to be religious and basically peaceful. To be religious, it doesn't mean that you necessarily always have to be peaceful. Sometimes to be religious is actually to put, let's say, the end to assaults, the end to injustice. That's what it means to be religious. Sometimes you have to stand your grounds and actually say, nope, that's it. And this is important to keep in mind. And and of course, I'll tell you, many will right there will come at you and say, I thought you were religious, you're nothing but a hypocrite, etc., because they assumed that to be religious is to accept to be a doormat, is to be forgiving all the time. No, sometimes it's not an issue of forgiveness alone. Sometimes it's an issue of making sure that such assaults do not continue. And this is important. And I guess you don't see a lot of people, a lot of scholars actually teaching that it's always about, hey, just forgive. And definitely there's definitely a reward for forgiving. But when we're speaking about afa wa aslaha, there has to be, you want to do you want to do that al-i'fa, you want to do that, I guess, forgiveness, and you want to seek forgiveness. But where's the aslaha? Did they do al-islah? Did they show remorse to committing such assaults? What does it mean? So yes, in that situation, it's important to look at the circumstance, to look at what makes a fair compensation, and at the same time, making sure that you put an end to such assaults is important. And is no less important that seeking different ways to stop the assault on other people, and not necessarily just stopping the assault on yourself. So sometimes it's important to go out there and actually, you know, probably sue them in court and say, no, this is actually becoming rampant. This person is getting away with it. And more victims are coming in. Sometimes we need strong people to stand up and actually face that. Okay, let's continue.
Is it kind of عفو عند المقدرة?
العفو عند المقدرة, العفو عند المقدرة, there's a difference.
Not
And it's a
here.
fine line. Oh, just give me a second. There's a fine line between when you are in a situation of courage and between a situation in where it's not maqdira. When you're talking about al-afwa inda al-maqdira, we're talking about when you're in a position of power, when you're in a position of courage. You've got the courage, you've got the ability to retaliate, but you chose to give up. But if we're talking about al-afwa inda al-maqdira, when you're weak, no, that's not courage. That was actually being a coward. There's a fine line between al-jubun and al-shaja'a. There's also a fine line between al-jubun and a person, you know, being a coward and saying, yeah, well, I'm just going to forgive the person. No, it's not that you forgave the person. It's that you didn't have the power to get your rights. If you didn't have the power to get your rights, don't consider that afwa inda al-maqdira. It's that you were a coward to stand up for yourself. But al-afwa inda al-maqdira, that's when you are capable of retaliating hard. You're now in a place of power. But then you chose, you know, I'm just going to forgive that person, even though I have the ability to really retaliate hard. I've got the real good resources and all those different things where I could really harm that person back the way they harmed me. But then I'm going to choose to forgive. That's an afwa inda al-maqdira. But when you're already weak and you're being stepped on, and you're going to say, well, I'm just going to al-afwa inda al-maqdira. No, you're being weak at that time. Just couldn't defend yourself. And guess what happens? When you don't defend yourself in a smaller and in minor assaults, those bullies, they're going to come at you with bigger assaults. And they're just weighing your power. They're just weighing how much you can take. They're just weighing how much you can cope and how much you're willing to stand up for yourself. If you're not willing to stand up, there are certain assaults. Don't continue to actually say that, hey, I'm doing al-afwa inda al-maqdira, when in reality, what is at stake is that you're letting more bullies transgress their limits with you. And this is important. In Islam, no. Have izzah. You have to have izzah. You have to have that honor. Don't be a doormat. I know as women at many times, of course, we would think that, no, we're supposed to be nice. We're supposed to be kind. We don't hear this kind of language. We don't usually hear this kind of language, and we would usually think of it as a feminist language. No, this is Islam. To have izzah, that's Islam. To have the courage to stop injustice, this is Islam. This is not feminism. This is Islam. To stop injustice is Islam. To stand up for truth is Islam. To stand up for justice, this is Islam. To make sure that you are putting an end to those that are transgressing the limit is actually what it means to be a leader. Now, that's on the same, at the same time, it doesn't mean to transgress the limit on others and consider that as courage. That's not courage when you transgress the limit on others. That's actually dhulm. There's dhulm in courage. It's basically shara. It's just one fine line. Is that small difference in where dhulm, oppression, and being a tyrant, and courage. It's one fine line. One is standing up for justice, and one is abusing their power to commit injustice. That's the difference. One is using their power to stand up for justice. That's courage. And one is using their power to basically commit injustice. What is that fine line? Well, look at the situation, learn your deen, and make sure that you got your boundaries set. And once your boundaries are set, that's when you're going to be capable of recognizing how strong should you be in defending the situation. Because once you have a clear vision, then you're capable of defining and figuring out those lines and those borders. Once you figure out those lines and borders, then you're capable of standing in support, standing, like I said, in the National Guard, and you'll stand up and be capable of standing up in support of haqq and truth, and you'll right there feel that, no, I've got my vision in place. Now I should stand to defend it. Whether we're talking about Islam or whether we're talking about people's rights that Islam had considered as people's rights, and etc. And I'll tell you, once you stand up for haqq, you will find a lot of people. You will find a lot of people accusing you of being strict. Why? Because they're not used to finding anyone say, well, this is where the borderline is. And you'll lose a lot of friends. Just right there, just keep in mind. The second that you stand up for haqq, the second that you stand up and say, well, this is right and this is wrong. This is what you did. This is what you did wrong, and this is what you did right, and this is what you don't have the right to do, and this is what you have the right to do. You will be losing a lot of friends. You will have a lot of people that will be talking against you. You will have a lot of people that are considering you as basically the enemy, because people are not used to anybody standing up and saying, well, this is where the right and end basically begin and end. وَقَفَّيْنَا عَلَى أَثَارِهِمْ بِعِيسَى بْنِ مَرْيَمَ. Let's continue with that ayah before we get carried away. You could see, I know, and sometimes, subhanAllah, it's really sad when we see within the society so much harm, and at the same time, very few people to actually say this is haqq and this is batil. And especially when...
But that's just like the prophets, right?
Of course. But it's really sad when you don't have scholars that have the power to implement haqq. They don't have the power to implement haqq. They don't have the power to tell those abusive husbands what you did was haram. To tell those abusive women You can't just take your husband's wealth, or you can't just deny your husband from seeing his children, or whatever it is. There are abusive women, and there are abusive husbands, and there are abusive men, and there are abusive children, and abusive parents. This is reality. But of course, the second that you stand up and you start saying, this is what Islam says, they'll basically start, don't want to hear it. Most people don't want to hear it. And you'll start seeing either writing against the sheikh because he supported, for example, if it's a woman, he supported my husband, and basically accuse him of being a misogynist. And if it's a man, basically if he supported the woman, he'll basically say, oh, he's basically feminist right there, and they'll basically start going to ad hominem, start attacking the sheikh, or start attacking the imam and attacking his intention. And then we end up really the society continuing in their assault. There's no way that you can implement justice without having law enforcement. There's no way. You have to have power. You have to have power. That when that second that the imam says, this is the al-hukm al-shar'i, this is the Islamic ruling, and the man doesn't apply it, there has to be that government to say, oh, you don't want to apply it? Don't worry, we know how to exactly deal with you. We're going to take your money from your bank. We're going to put you in jail, etc. And we're going to let those guys in those uniforms deal with you, and they'll teach you a good lesson. Same thing if we're talking about a woman. Same thing if we're talking about children. Same thing we're talking about parents. Sometimes those bullies, they need other people to bully them. You go to prisons and you'll see the difference between those officers and those that are actually inmates and inmate gowns. It's really just a uniform. But even the officers become bullies. And sometimes this is the kind of language that they understand. Bullies, they're not going to come and sit and listen to a lecture. They only know one language. It's called the fist. It's called power. That's the only language that they understand. So to think that, oh, let's talk to them about the importance of justice and the philosophy of it and all of that, oh, you're just wasting your breath. It's just one language. It's called the durra. The language of Umar ibn Khattab. Got a stick and his cane and his stick. And you know what? That's the language that I'm going to be using. You just really need a good spank, and that's going to teach you a lesson, going to get you on, that's going to get you on track right there, and make sure that you're going to stay on border. That's the situation that we're living in. We're living at a time when there's no power. And in Allah la yaz'u bil-sultani ma la yaz'u bil-Quran. Uthman bin Affan said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would put power in sultan to meaning the government, to meaning the leader. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not put in the Quran itself. You can read the Quran on that bully all the time, and you can give all those beautiful lectures, and you can cry and all of that. Oh, they only know one language. Just show them Durra and show them that spanking, and really bring about those officers. They'll pin them down, get them handcuffed, and that's when you stop those bullies. But if you actually think, oh, I'm just going to call this person to the masjid and I'm going to talk to him, etc., the scholars are wasting their breaths. Sorry, but this is the reality of most cases. This is the reality of most cases. Bullies only know one language, which is power. And many times, unfortunately, I'm not necessarily saying scholars are wasting their breath, but they know very well when it's an assault on their daughters. They know very well that there's nothing that they could do, and that they really have to take it with those that are in power. They know that very well. But many women don't really realize, and many men don't realize. They think, well, what if I were to use, the way of talking and all of that? Certainly, that's the beginning. Why not? Power, and let's say that the method of violence, let's say it that way, is definitely the last resort. We definitely have to use first to probably reach out to the heart before we start reaching out to our durra. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, it's very important to know that being Muslim doesn't mean being weak. Being Muslim doesn't mean that you accept people assaulting you, people spitting at you. And what I mean by spitting here, I mean using bad language and starting to attack you. No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that you have to accept it. It's very important to say, oh, you got to stop right there. You got to watch your mouth. You got to watch your boundaries. No, I will not accept that you would talk to me that way. Or I would not accept that you would trespass your boundary. Know that you don't have the right to do this and do that. Let them know that you are standing your grounds. In being Muslim, it doesn't mean that you be a doormat at all. Even if you're a wife, it doesn't mean that you become a doormat. I hope my words don't get misunderstood. وقفينا على آثارهم بعيسى ابن مريم مصدقا لما بين يديه من التوراة وآتيناه الإنجيل فيه هدى ونور ومصدقا لما بين يديه من التوراة وهدى وموعظة. Of course, right there. بين يديه من التوراة وهدى وموعظة للمتقين وليحكم أهل الإنجيل بما أنزل الله فيه ومن لم يحكم بما أنزل الله فأولئك هم الفاسقون. So let me translate first the words in English really quick. وقفينا. قفينا would actually mean it was a trace. It's something that was tracing back. In other words, it was pushing forward on the same path of the prophets, and of course, بعيسى ابن مريم, the path of the prophets, and then Prophet Isa alayhi salam, the son of Mary, was coming to confirm what was already revealed in the Torah, and he was granted the Gospels in where it contained guidance and light, in confirming what was revealed in the past in the Torah, and what it contained was guidance and a good reminder for those that were living in piety. And let the people of the Gospels rule what was revealed, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed in it. And whoever does not rule what was revealed by Allah, then those are the people that are the transgressors, or al-fasiqun, meaning that they would basically expose themselves to fitna. We'll talk about that. Let's see, right there, وَقَفَّيْنَا عَلَى أَثَارِهِمْ بِعِيسَى ابْنِ مَرْيَمَ. The question is, how is this related with the ayah that was before? So the way that we could see that it's related, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking about it, Torah. Remember what with the Torah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking about how they were coming forward, and where what they were doing, yusari'una fil kufr, they were rushing into kufr, and they would basically say that they were believers, but in reality their hearts weren't even believing, and they would listen to the lies, they would fabricate words, and they would listen to the lies, and they would continue exposing themselves to the point that they would even fabricate and added the word of the Lord Almighty, or even change the interpretation, and then they would basically come forward and to ask their people to basically take whatever is in their favor and in ruling, and then reject what is not in their favor. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills their fitna, that means their delusion, then you're not going to be capable of doing anything to them, because that's the path that they had chosen. So those are the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not want to purify their hearts, and in dunya they would have khizi, and in akhirah they khizi to mean humiliation, and in the hereafter they would basically have the severe punishment and the torments right there. In where then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell us the story of those, the Bani Israel, the Yahud, when they had come pretended that they were coming in to learn about the Prophet ﷺ or coming in to basically seek the ruling when they know what the ruling was, but they did not want to apply the ruling of the Lord Almighty. That's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically expose them and say, well, we had revealed the Torah. In it, there was light, there was guidance, and then they were, throughout history, were supposed to be applying the rules that were in it, and بِمَا اسْتُحْفِظُوا مِنْ كِتَابِ اللَّهِ, what they were basically what they were basically given the ordained to apply from the book of the Lord Almighty, but they didn't actually do so. Well, speaking of Ahl al-Tawrah, then that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, well, it wasn't just the people of Ahl al-Tawrah, but that's the same thing in where when Prophet Isa alayhi salam, anyways, Prophet Isa alayhi salam, Virgin Mary was basically an Israeliyah. She was anyways from the children of Israel. Isa ibn Maryam was not from the children of Israel because he was the son of Mary and not going back, because remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Ud'uuhum li'abaihim," and call them and name them based on their fathers. Ud'uuhum li'abaihim, based on their fathers. So of course, Prophet Isa alayhi salam is not a descendant of Bani Israel, but he was sent within Bani Israel. So of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues in where you had prophets, and because anyways it was right there telling us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent throughout history in where يَحْكُمُ بِهَا النَّبِيُّونَ. Throughout history, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the Torah in where they were ruling based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent in it, the guidance for all, and the nur, the light for those that are, of course, at a higher level of knowledge and wanting to look deeper. And of course, later on, قَفَّيْنَا عَلَى أَثَرِهِمْ. So you could see that قَفَّيْنَا عَلى أَثَرِهِمْ is actually coming in where you could see coming in, continuing with this ayah, in where it was talking about the Torah and then telling us and give us an idea of what was actually revealed as a default ruling in what actually makes a fair trial, what actually makes justice. And it isn't until, of course, we had seen that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had even sent with the same, let's say, justice, with the same trace of justice, with the same ordeal, with the same ruling, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was always right there, even sending the prophets from one prophet to another until Prophet Isa ibn Maryam, in where in it was actually confirming what was in the Torah, and even the Injil itself, the Gospels were confirming what is in the Torah, in where it was all a chain of light throughout history. It was a chain of guidance to basically guide people in knowing about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also a chain of light to help people identify justice, to help people identify what is right and what is wrong. And it basically confirmed لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ مِنَ التَّوْرَةِ. It was confirming, one, the prophecy about the Prophet ﷺ, two, the legacy that the prophets had been sent with, what the prophets had also been sent with in terms of guidance, the rules, the morality, what defines ethics, and all of that. And of course, in it is basically guidance and a reminder for those that wanted to apply taqwa, those that lived taqwa. So therefore, let them rule, whether we're speaking about Ahl al-Injil, what was revealed in it. When you talk about ruling, does that mean they should leave Islam and just basically go back to the Bible? Well, anyways, the gospel itself is not necessarily right now complete. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed revealed the Quran in order to bring about, one, an exposure to what was purposely hidden, or what was purposely edited, or what was purposely misedited, or what was by mistake also edited, or by mistake, and certainly some of it was not necessarily on purpose, some of it was by mistake, some of it was intentional, some of it was not intentional. All right, so that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلْيَحْكُمْ أَهْلُ الْإِنْجِيلِ. Does that بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فِيهِ, does that mean Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking them to apply the rules that are in Injil? Well, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent al-Quran as abrogating, as the final revelation, abrogating all the different rules and all the different legislatures that were sent on to in the Torah or even in the Gospels. So is this necessarily speaking about the prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ, or is this talking about ruling based on what was in the Gospels, when we know that the Gospel itself didn't really contain, let's call it, rulings, and that the rulings were generally in the Old Testament / at-Torah. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. And those that would not rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what He had revealed, then those are the people that are fasiqun. What is al-fasiq? Fasaqa, remember we said this many times, fasaqa actually means to remove the shield and off, or the peel off the fruit, and therefore exposing it to getting rotten and exposing it to decay. So once we basically don't apply the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the same thing that happens to human beings, in where the second that you don't apply the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are going to be exposing yourself to decay. You're going to be exposing yourself to basically decay on your spiritual level, in probably the society, and of course, justice, etc. Social injustices are going to be prevalent, and certainly even psychological illnesses, mental illnesses, all these different things, it's basically going to expose you to becoming decay. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, now therefore you recognize, أَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the book, that is the Quran, in truth, and what it contains within it is that it confirms what was revealed onto Prophet Isa alayhi salam, what was revealed unto Prophet Isa alayhi salam, or is it ma bayna yaday, meaning Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So is this pronoun going back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or is this pronoun going back to Prophet Isa alayhi salam? At the end, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was right there confirming that He had sent the Quran, and sent the Quran as the final revelation to confirm what was revealed throughout history in the Gospels or in the Torah. And of course, what the Quran was also containing is also confirming what was already prophesied, of course, in the Gospels and in the Torah. وَمُهَيْمِنًا, in another qira'ah, وَمُهَيْمَنًا. Okay, in another qira'ah, in where it is basically to go al-muhaymin, to mean that it would be one, sealing to complete the message, or is it to mean superior? We'll talk about that. فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. So, O Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the al-ibra bi'umum al-lafzi la bikhusus al-sabab, of course, in where ordering all to rule by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed, and do not follow their own ahwa, do not follow their whims and desires. And in other words, don't let the whims and desires, or perhaps your feelings, and prevent you from judging what was revealed in truth onto you. Each one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically sent shir'atan wa minhaja. When you look at shir'a, sharia basically means spring. But this is not a metaphorical word here. Shir'ata wa minhaja. This is talking about each one had a legislature, each one had a path, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically rules in different times, at different ways, what suits that society. And certainly in the Torah there were certain rules that were abrogated, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have wanted, وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had wanted that all people would rule by the same thing, and throughout history it would be one rule, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have done so. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, because the different circumstances, because of the different situations, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ فِيمَا آتَاكُمْ, to test the people, how would they apply, how they would apply the words of the Lord Almighty. فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. So then you would have to rush and expedite and make your competition in wanting to basically go for what is good. And remember, your return is all going to be to the Lord Almighty, and He would basically tell you, or the word فَيُنَبِّئُكُمْ is not to inform you per se, but it is more in where He will expose what you had done. Expose what you had done. Ya Rabbi, nas'Allah al-afwa wal-afiyah, nas'Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those that would be given the hasanat in where this is what you did not know in good deeds that you had done or you had forgotten. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make content. فَيُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ فِيهِ تَخْتَلِفُونَ. And the Lord Almighty would expose, or even, of course, let you, and here, let you, and you would be then exposed to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had foretold you, and what you used to dispute about. Right now, you'll see it right before your eyes. And now there's no way that you're going to doubt what you're seeing. You doubted Judgment Day? Well, now you see it. What do you think? Is it real? You doubted Allah. What do you think? Was He real? You doubted Jannah. Is it real? So that's where, right there, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala فَيُنَبِّئُكُمْ, then you'll know. In other words, this فَيُنَبِّئُكُم, it's not an informative clause, but it's actually a form of giving people a warning. It's a threat. That's so scary. وَأَنِ احْكُم بَيْنَهُم بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُم, and rule amongst them with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed. وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُم, and don't follow their whims and desires, and beware that they would take you away or bring about a trial and put you in a delusion away from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed upon you. And if they were to turn away, then know that the Lord Almighty, أَنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ أَن يُصِيبَهُم بِبَعْضِ ذُنُوبِهِمْ, that the Lord Almighty wanted them to be held accountable for what they had committed in sin. And what most people are لَفَاسِقُونَ. Most people are basically just living away from the path of the Lord Almighty. أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ يَبْغُونَ. Why would they want the ruling of al-Jahiliyyah? Basically, the ruling of al-Jahiliyyah is any ruling that is not the ruling of the Lord Almighty. And there's no better ruling than the ruling of the Lord Almighty for those that are capable of seeing the truth. يُوقِنُونَ. So this is the page that hopefully, inshallah, we'll be working on the coming days. And definitely a lot to say. So you could see that we pretty much are not in rulings anymore. Rulings would take a lot of time, but you could see we're not in rulings anymore. So therefore, right now, you're going to see those ayat. We're going to be rushing in those ayat because the rulings, they pretty much had basically been mentioned. And there are going to be more rulings at the end, but inshallah, we'll continue. And subhanakallahumma hamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I have a question, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, on ayah 46, why it repeated 2 times مصدقا لما بين يديه من التوراة. Then he said مصدقا لما بين يديه من التوراة وهدى. Is it one related to the Prophet Aysha عليه السلام and the
fair enough. So
Muhammad
in Lugha Arabiya, sometimes the repetition is to give confirmation, للتأكيد والتوكيد, and sometimes the repetition is basically to give a reminder, and sometimes the repetition could be for al-ishtimal, in order to be inclusive and just relate to let you relate to the previous point that it was talking about. So we're going to go right there and actually see in where, what does it really mean? Why was there that repetition? And of course, we're going to see, is there any mughayara? Is there any difference? Is this some form of giving us a new meaning, or is this to confirm a meaning that was mentioned before? So in Lugha Arabiya, there sometimes can be that that repetition, just like in the Quran. You will find some repetition in the Quran, and the repetition basically is to be put within the context in order to understand. Is it to confirm? Is it to basically give a new meaning? Or is it to basically be including in confirming a new meaning, and where you're giving us istimal? So is it to confirm? Is it to add a new meaning? Or is it to basically include a new set of ideas based on the context? So we'll talk about that, inshallah. It isn't just this one that you would see as repeated here, but you'll have different words and different ayat in where you'll see وَلْيَحْكُمْ أَهْلُ الْإِنْجِيلِ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. Okay, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ. You can see it was repeated many times. أَنَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. It was repeated many times. And then right there, in where the whole idea, كَثِيرًا مِنَ النَّاسِ لَفَاسِقُونَ, the ideas are pretty much within, of course, the same context, within the same idea. But of course, because we recognize that we want to go farther, not just take a general idea, because we're trying to scrutinize the implications. And of course, we want to study how our behavior, how our thoughts, how our hearts are basically changed. So we're right there digging and delving deep inside those ayat, because we recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the Quran in where each and every single word, every single pronoun, every single sentence, and even every single word in the choice that it was taken is basically for a hikmah, for a wisdom, in where we're trying to, let's say, scrutinize and deconstruct, let's say it that way, deconstruct these words in order to basically bring about an instruction within our mind, a vision to understand how we can understand the world around us by understanding the Quran. What is it really trying to tell us? How do we understand what affects the humans, and where does the huda come from? Where does the guidance come from? Where's the nur come from? Are they the same thing? And when we look at al-fisq, why were they called fasiqeen? What is al-fisq? Can we as Muslims become fasiq too without us realizing? How do we relate to all of that? And of course, we go farther in where shir'atan wa minhaja. What's the difference between shir'a? And why is it saying shir'atan wa minhaja? Is one confirming? Is it more being inclusive? Or is it giving me a new meaning? Same thing. If we're talking about وَاحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, is it that the Prophet ﷺ was basically about to take in fitna? Is he himself going to be going into fitna? Or what was it? Was he going to go? I thought he was a prophet, infallible. Why does the ayah say وَاحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, and beware that they might put you in a delusion? Really? Why would is that am I understanding this right? We're going to go in details, inshallah. Or is this also telling us, and where no, it's not warning the Prophet ﷺ from fitna, but it's warning the Muslims from fitna? So this khitab or the discourse is directed at the Muslims, or is it directed at the Prophet ﷺ? And of course, فَعْلَمْ أَنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ أَن يُصِيبَهُم بِبَعْضِ ذُنُوبِهِم. Does that mean whatever sin we would commit, it's basically what brings in the calamities? So, but we're seeing people that are religious, that are really applying the religion, and we don't really see necessarily, those that are committing sins necessarily right there going to calamities. We see that they're actually living a better life, a better quality of life. How do we understand this? Somebody can be religious and they would still go into calamities, loss of a child, loss of job, and, losing probably their health and wealth and all of that. So how is it that we understand that أنما يريد الله أن يصيبهم ببعض ذنوبهم? How do we understand this one? وإن كثيرا من الناس لفاسقون. Most people are فاسقون. Is it okay for me to say, hey, most people are bad? Is that really the case? أفحكم الجاهلية يبغون. Now here, أفحكم, is this supposed to be a question? Or is this supposed to be right there more of a scolding statement? And we're telling them, what is Jahiliyyah anyways? Is Jahiliyyah just a pre-prophetic era? Or is Jahiliyyah can feminism be Jahiliyyah? Can secularism be Jahiliyyah? What is Jahiliyyah? And وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حُكْمًا. Are we talking about just rules? إِنْ لِقَوْمٍ يُوقِنُونَ. Who's a person that is reaching the level of yaqeen? So if they're reaching the level of yaqeen, that means that ruling by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to add them yaqeen. Or does that mean that's going to add them yaqeen? So, so many questions, but inshallah, you could see highlighted a lot. So, but inshallah, we will actually go in details, inshallah. You could see in those that would be in big brackets. Inshallah, we'll be talking about those. And you could see some of them favoring one child over another, perhaps, and the list goes on and on. So, yeah, this is it. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Any other questions?
Jazakallah khairan.
وإياكم ربي يحفظكم جميعا. And sorry if we kind of, you could see sometimes in halfway that I'm angry about something. But I'm
No,
pretty
I mean, it was good to emphasize that.
Alhamdulillah. It's important.
Yeah.
It's important. I mean,
I mean, we're not like the Christian. I mean, we're in the middle. We're not too lenient, and yet we're not too harsh.
Absolutely. It's not like the Christian way. Somebody slaps you on your right side, give them the left side.
No, we don't always have to turn the cheek.
There you go. No, I'm not going to let you to slap me left and right. I'm going to stand my ground and tell you no. I'm going to defend I'm going to defend the truth. Right there. This is it.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. I'm trying to stop the recording. Okay.